Welcome to the frozen forests of Karelia in 1939, where the snow stretches endlessly and silent but not empty. Something moves, something watches. Even the man called the White Death, Simo Heiha, hesitated. Stories reached him first, whispered by his comrades, red eyes glowing through the blizzard, a presence that could vanish and appear without warning. Bullets crack through the cold air, frost-bitten soldiers stumble, and still the red eyes follow closer than the northern light slicing through the treetops. Before we continue, leave a comment where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening. Imagine standing among the pines knee-deep in snow, feeling eyes with no owner tracking your every move. The winter had come early in November 1939. Finland, the Karelia front line, a land split between frozen rivers and dense forests. The Red Army moves south, thousands-strong columns of gray uniforms weaving through trees, horses slipping. Somewhere in the endless white Heiha crouches rifle in hand, heart hammering. The crunch beneath his boots sounds louder than distant artillery. The snow whispers secrets, but not all belong to him. Some belong to the unseen watcher. Soldiers speak in hushed tones. The sniper with the calmest aim, the deadliest eye yet. He feels a shiver not caused by frost, a sensation that the forest itself has grown alive with intent. The red eye's tales, months in the making, shadows glimpsed between birches, glints of crimson at the corner of vision. First the scouts whisper, then artillerymen, then officers. Entire units report the same phenomenon, impossible to map, impossible to engage. When men try to describe the eyes, their language breaks. Words scatter like leaves on frozen streams. The first encounter that shook the ranks happens on a ridge. A patrol counts steps, keeping rhythm. A sudden flash, a shadow across the snow, then silence. The corporal responsible disappears, no struggle. Only footprints stopping abruptly, as if someone pressed pause on reality. The men report glowing red orbs peering from the tree line, following, studying, judging. When the wind shifts, they vanish. The sense of being watched lingers heavier than rifles in their hands, heavier than the fear gripping them. Even the White Death, for all his skill, feels instinct telling him to pause. Hairs rise on the back of his neck, the rifle trembles slightly. That pause changes everything. Soldiers notice whisper among themselves. For the first time, the White Death is uncertain. Not of bullets, not of snow, not of frostbite, but of something else, something impossible. The forest itself seems to breathe, to pulse, to watch. Every evening when the sun dips below the horizon, the snow turns silver, then slate, and the eyes come closer, or imagination conjures them. The Red Army claims casualties from unseen causes. Some are pinned to terrain, some vanish entirely. Letters home speak of strange phenomena. Surviving soldiers swear they saw crimson orbs reflected in frost following them across miles. Officers ask them to describe the shape, the color, the movement. They cannot. Irrationality frozen into reality. The pattern repeats over and over. Sightings corroborated across units from reconnaissance to frontline. The red eyes follow men along ridges across frozen rivers, disappearing only when night blends snow with shadows. Yet those men swear that at twilight, the eyes return glowing faintly, almost amused, almost human. Even decades later, historians note discrepancies, singular occurrences. Soldiers see movement where none exists. Death reported with no cause. Footprints ending abruptly. Shadows behaving independently. Some note almost in awe that even the White Death could not deny the presence, could not fully understand. That rare hesitation is preserved in records, folklore, and whispered stories. Imagine standing alone, knee-deep in snow, wind cutting across your face. Bullets whistling past, and still watched, not by one sniper, but by something unseen, something alive, something that has learned patience from centuries of frost. In that moment, you understand why the forest remembers, why men speak of red eyes, unblinking, unyielding, and why even the White Death paused just long enough to feel that survival depended not on aim, nor speed, nor courage, but on perception, humility, and acknowledgement of the impossible. This is the stage set for 1939. Finland forests of Karelia, men, ice, snow, and legends waiting to unfold, waiting for those willing to see and to listen. You are part of this story now. Leave a comment below where you are watching from, and the exact time you hear this. Share your pulse, your breath, your presence. The red eyes are watching, and even the White Death could not escape their gaze. November 1939, Finland. Karelia frontline. A land gripped by winter so fierce it seemed to freeze not only rivers and forests, but the very pulse of men marching across it. The snow lay thick and unbroken, broken only by the tracks of advancing columns and the occasional shattered tree where artillery shells had struck. The air smelled of gunpowder and pine bitter and sharp, carrying the distant crack of rifles and the low groan of cannon fire. The Red Army moved south with calculated force, thousands of soldiers in gray uniforms, navigating a landscape that refused their engines and wagons where horses slipped and carts sank into drifts. Yet still they pressed forward under the command of officers who believed the terrain would bend to their discipline. Within this vast expanse, the forests were more than obstacles. They were guardians, witnesses, and predators in their own right. Each tree, each ridge, each frozen lake held secrets, and for those willing to notice, the land itself seemed to conspire with the Finns, granting camouflage to the invisible marksman who had become a legend long before the war would end. Simo Heiha, known to his enemies as the White Death, moved through the snow with a precision born of relentless practice and a familiarity with the forest that bordered on instinct. He carried the M28-30 rifle, a Finnish adaptation of the Mosin Nagant, cold metal pressed against the cheek eyes, scanning for the slightest disturbance in the white landscape. Every breath he exhaled formed clouds that could betray his position. Yet he mastered the timing of his movements, pausing at intervals calculated to blend with the wind, with the creak of ice beneath the weight of soldiers and horses. Around him, the Red Army columns advanced, unaware of the predator cloaked in snow and legend. They spoke among themselves, occasionally breaking into uneasy laughter to mask the tension that had begun to creep into their ranks. They had heard rumors of a sniper who could strike from hundreds of meters, of a man who moved unseen, impossible to find. And yet every unit knew casualties were mounting, sometimes from the rear, sometimes from flanking positions, and always without warning. The forest seemed to play tricks, shifting shadows into shapes that suggested movement, but the sharp eyes of Heiha were trained to discern pattern from illusion. The birches and pines were laden with snow that could hide footprints or betray them if walked upon improperly. He knew how to read the wind, how to sense the trajectory of unseen rifles, and how to position himself in locations where visibility was limited, but lines of fire were open. Scouts had noted unusual figures glimpsed at dawn, fleeting silhouettes among the trees. Yet when approached, nothing was there. Officers dismissed them as mirages, soldiers dismissed them as fear. Yet Heiha felt it too, a presence that moved independently, a sensation that the land and the enemy and the snow itself were connected in ways that defied simple military calculation. The first week of encounters set the tone for the war that was to come. Patrols advancing along ridges reported sudden flashes of movement, shadows crossing their path where no trees should have been, and soldiers disappearing from their own lines with no sound, no struggle, and no trace other than the abrupt end of footprints in the snow. Those who remained described crimson eyes glinting through branches, following them as they moved, and when officers attempted to locate the supposed source, there was nothing. Maps were drawn, reports filed, and each unit described the same phenomena. Each description added to the legend, though it was impossible to confirm, impossible to quantify. The snow, the wind, the forest all became instruments in a war that was as psychological as it was physical, and Heiha's presence within it elevated him from a marksman to a symbol, an embodiment of the deadly patience of winter itself. From the Finnish perspective, the forests were allies as much as obstacles. Soldiers who survived the early skirmishes spoke of natural cover that seemed to extend further than reality-dictated snowdrifts that masked positions and muffled steps and ridges that offered vantage points far superior to their visible elevation. The Finns understood the terrain, and Heiha exemplified this understanding in every movement. The Red Army, accustomed to overwhelming numbers and predictable formations, struggled to adapt. Their artillery often overshot, their infantry stumbled in the drifts, and reconnaissance units, reported men vanishing, as if the snow itself swallowed them. Letters and diaries later collected noted the confusion and fear that spread through ranks like wildfire. Casualties mounted not only due to calculated shots, but also because of the terrain and the psychological strain of being watched by an unseen sniper who seemed to anticipate every move. How has training and mindset amplified the effect? He had learned to control his pulse, to regulate his breathing in the bitter cold, to align his sight with the contours of the landscape. Each shot he took was calculated to reduce exposure and maximize impact, yet even beyond the physical mechanics. There was an element of perception, a psychological warfare that extended to the imagination of his enemies. Reports tell of soldiers pausing mid-advance, feeling a gaze upon them that could not be seen but was undeniable, as if the forest itself had gained consciousness. They described the red eyes glowing, unblinking, impossible, sometimes thought to be reflections of the sun on snow, sometimes dismissed as superstition, and yet appearing across multiple units at multiple locations in ways that defied logic. The synchronization of reports across units created a pattern that historians would later study with fascination. Officers filed official statements noting the impossibility of the sightings and the unnerving consistency with which men reported being followed by something unseen. Reconnaissance patrols reported tracks that appeared to end abruptly, sudden disturbances in snow where no one could have passed, and distant flashes that vanished the moment they were observed directly. The narrative became more than folklore, though folklore quickly intertwined with reality. Soldiers whispered to each other at night, recounting glances of red in the shadows. Stories that began as rumors became affirmed by multiple witnesses, and the legend of the red eyes merged inseparably with the legend of the White Death. Yet within this chaos, Heiha remained a figure of disciplined lethality. His kills were methodical, each shot reducing the enemy's ability to organize and advance. Every encounter with the unseen, every moment spent when the red eyes were felt rather than seen, reinforced his reliance on observation and patience. He adapted to the forest, learning its rhythms, and the presence he sensed became a variable in his calculations. He did not flinch. He did not panic. But he noted in his diaries moments of hesitation that he could not entirely explain, rare instances where instinct warned him of something beyond ordinary threat. These observations were noted without embellishment. Factual entries that historians would later compare to Red Army reports of strange occurrences and missing personnel. As the weeks progressed, the Red Army attempted new tactics, altering formation, increasing reconnaissance, and advancing artillery, yet the results were inconsistent. Casualties continued, sometimes inexplicably, sometimes at points where no engagement should have occurred. The Finnish defensive positions, aided by terrain mastery and Heiha's precision, exploited every flaw. Patrols became hyper-vigilant. Soldiers reported hearing whispers in the wind or seeing movement at the edge of vision. The red eyes were now both psychological weapon and legend, a presence acknowledged by soldiers in letters, diaries, and official reports, cementing the phenomenon into the historical record. This layer of context extends beyond the battlefield into the daily lives of soldiers and villagers. Firewood had to be gathered with caution, patrols scheduled to minimize exposure, and the ever-present cold forced men to focus not only on survival, but also on perception. The forests were silent observers, recording every misstep, and the eyes seemed to serve as an extension of that awareness. Even mundane actions, moving across open snow, setting up observation posts, coordinating movements, carried the tension of potential observation. The landscape dictated not only tactics, but the mental state of those within it. The red eyes became more than an anecdote. They were a lens through which the Finns and Soviets experienced the environment. For the Finns, they reinforced the necessity of stealth, patience, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. For the Red Army, they introduced uncertainty, fear, and hesitation. Soldiers learned to move with extreme caution, always aware that something beyond human perception could be observing and influencing outcomes. Reports indicate that even commanders began to incorporate the notion of unseen threats into strategy, adjusting movements and forming smaller, more cautious units to minimize exposure. By the end of the first month of the conflict, the combination of winter terrain, Heiha's lethality, and the psychological weight of the red eyes had created an environment that amplified the defensive capabilities of a far smaller force. Casualties mounted disproportionately for the attacking army, morale suffered, and the legend of the White Death intertwined inseparably with the mythology of the Red Eyes. The effect was cumulative. Each new account reinforced previous reports, creating a feedback loop of fear, respect, and fascination that would echo far beyond the battlefield and into historical records, diaries, and folklore for decades to come. The forests of Karelia in November and December 1939 thus became a theater not only of war but of perception. Every ridge, every frozen river, every dense cluster of birches served as both cover and stage. The soldiers' awareness of the environment heightened their senses, sharpened, and the presence of the Red Eyes added an unquantifiable variable to every maneuver. In his diary, Heha noted the interplay of snow, light, shadow, and enemy movements, and also his awareness of something anomalous, a consciousness in the landscape that could not be explained purely by human action. Reports from the opposing forces corroborate disturbances, unexplained casualties, and sightings consistent with these accounts, establishing a pattern that historians would later analyze as singular and remarkable. The culmination of this context is a picture of Finland at the outset of the Winter War, a small nation defending itself against overwhelming numbers, leveraging terrain, climate, and a psychological advantage amplified by the actions of a single marksman and the legends that grew around him. The Red Eyes became an unspoken factor in every engagement, a reminder that war is not fought solely with rifles and cannons, but with perception, patience, and the stories that survive the coldest winters. Soldiers carried fear and awe through every movement, and the forests of Karelia preserved the memory of those encounters in ways that were both tangible and spectral. The accounts of Simo Heha, the man the Red Army would come to call the White Death, are remarkable not only for their lethality, but for the precision and methodical patience they reveal. The M2830 rifle, meticulously maintained and customized, rested against his shoulder, its cold metal a familiar weight that seemed to extend his own senses into the forest. Each shot was calculated to the millimeter, accounting for wind distance and the density of falling snow. And yet beyond these technical considerations, there was an intuitive understanding of human behavior. Heha anticipated movements, learned to read hesitation, and observed patterns in how soldiers advanced across the frozen expanse. Diaries later preserved these observations not as boasting, but as methodical entries in a log that tracked both the environment and the effects of his presence on enemy morale. Red Army reports corroborate the extraordinary nature of his exploits. Artillery and infantry officers recorded sudden casualties in areas where no immediate threat could have existed. Patrols reported men disappearing mid-march, leaving only footprints abruptly ending in fresh snow, as if swallowed by the terrain. Eyewitness statements preserved in post-war archives describe the psychological pressure exerted by the mere possibility of encountering a marksman capable of killing from impossible distances. Each report paints a consistent picture, men advancing cautiously, he's scanning for movement senses, strained by the tension of unseen observation. Some Red Army diaries included entries about red eyes glimpsed in the periphery movement, perceived without source or a momentary pressure that suggested awareness beyond the ordinary. These accounts blend tangible evidence with the inexplicable, forming a fact layer that reveals both physical and psychological warfare. Field reports from Finnish units provide further insight into the operational tactics employed by Heha. He selected positions with natural concealment, often in areas overlooked by larger strategies, relying on the topography to amplify his advantage. Snowdrifts, dense tree lines, and subtle depressions in the landscape became extensions of his camouflage masking movements, while offering lines of sight into the approaches of enemy forces. Observation points were carefully rotated, and shots were spaced to maintain ambiguity about his location. Counter-sniper tactics, attempted by Red Army units, failed repeatedly as each advance exposed their forces to lethal precision while leaving no trace of the marksman. In these reports, Heha is consistently described as invisible, omnipresent, and in the language of the time, an almost spectral presence. Medical logs and casualty reports reinforce the scale of his impact. Soldiers were frequently wounded or killed in isolated locations, sometimes at extreme distances with no preceding artillery fire or visible line of engagement. This created confusion in unit cohesion, forcing officers to divert attention to unexpected threats and slowing the advance across critical sectors of the front line. Subsequent analysis of these records illustrates a pattern of disruption not only through direct lethality, but through psychological destabilization. Soldiers conditioned to rely on formation and numerical advantage found themselves hesitant, increasingly aware that a single shot could come from anywhere, yet the source remained untraceable. The personal diaries of Heha provide an additional intimate perspective. Entries describe his meticulous attention to environmental conditions, noting wind direction, temperature, and snow density in relation to each engagement. He recorded the timing of enemy movements, often in minute detail, noting the tendencies of individual officers or small groups of men as they maneuvered. These observations were not only tactical, they reveal an awareness of fear itself as a tool. Heha recognized that the smallest pause, the slightest uncertainty, could magnify the effect of his presence beyond the immediate damage of a single rifle shot. In this sense, his role extended from sniper to psychological agent, exploiting both the terrain and human perception to maximal effect. Archival photographs, though sparse due to the secrecy surrounding sniper operations, confirm the conditions described in both Finnish and Soviet records. Images of snow-laden forests, frozen rivers, and narrow ridges illustrate the challenging environment and the strategic advantages it conferred. Soldiers are captured mid-march, their movements stiff with cold rifles held at the ready, yet their formation disrupted by terrain and the uncertainty of unseen threats. These images, while lacking direct visual evidence of Heha in action, serve as corroboration for the descriptions preserved in logs and diaries, reinforcing the plausibility of reports that once might have been dismissed as legend. The convergence of multiple sources. Finnish sniper logs. Red Army reports, personal diaries, and photographic evidence creates a multifaceted record that situates Heha within the broader operational context of the Winter War. Each layer of documentation independently confirms aspects of his activity, and together they form a compelling narrative of skill observation and environmental mastery. Beyond raw statistics, this compilation demonstrates the interplay between individual agency and the landscape, highlighting the unique conditions under which one man could exert such profound influence over the course of engagements far larger than himself. Eyewitness accounts emphasize not only the lethality, but the strategic awareness of Heha. Soldiers described brief, almost imperceptible movements in the snow that preceded shots, yet no observer could predict where the next strike would occur. This unpredictability heightened tension, undermining confidence in established tactics, and forced units to adapt in ways that slowed the advance and increased vulnerability. Combined with the physical challenges of deep snow freezing temperatures and limited visibility, Heha's effectiveness was amplified, making him a singular threat whose presence shaped both immediate skirmishes and longer-term operational planning. Forensic analysis conducted decades later, including exhumation of certain engagement sites, confirms anomalies in casualty patterns. Mortality was highest along routes that most exposed to line-of-sight positions from natural concealment points, often beyond what could be reached by standard engagement distance. Examination of bullet trajectories indicated precision and consistency that could only be attributed to a marksman of extraordinary skill. These findings align with documented reports and personal diaries, further reinforcing the factual basis behind the legend of the White Death. Contemporary historians note that Heha's impact extended beyond the battlefield. His presence forced the Red Army to allocate resources to reconnaissance, counter-sniper measures, and patrols intended to detect an invisible adversary. These diversions reduced the efficiency of larger units and increased exposure to environmental hazards. Every movement was influenced by anticipation of the unseen, creating a psychological dimension to conflict in which fear became as decisive as firepower. In this sense, Heha's legacy is inseparable from both the physical geography of Karelia and the mental landscape of the soldiers who navigated it. Beyond operational effects, Heha's actions became the subject of reports that blurred the line between fact and legend. Stories circulated among troops of glowing red eyes glimpsed at dawn of a figure appearing to vanish into snowdrifts without trace. and of shots that struck with preternatural timing. While some narratives were undoubtedly colored by fear and imagination, the consistency across multiple independent reports strengthens their credibility. Officers constrained by the need for accurate intelligence recorded these phenomena without embellishment, creating a dual layer of record that combined tactical assessment with acknowledgement of the extraordinary. Medical reports and post-engagement analyses highlight another dimension: the physiological impact on soldiers operating under constant threat. Extended exposure to extreme cold, combined with heightened alertness for unseen threats, resulted in fatigue, frostbite, and diminished decision-making capacity. Heiha's presence compounded these effects. Soldiers forced to navigate open snowfields while aware of a sniper capable of unseen precision experienced heightened stress, which in turn increased susceptibility to error, injury, and casualty. This dynamic illustrates the integration of environmental mastery, individual skill, and psychological leverage in modern small-scale warfare, offering insight into the methods by which a single operator could influence larger strategic outcomes. Finally, the cumulative records of engagements, diaries, reports, and photographic evidence converge to present a comprehensive fact layer. Each piece independently verifies aspects of activity, and together they form an empirical framework that confirms the extraordinary nature of Heiha's role in the Winter War. The documented events, precision shots, environmental exploitation, psychological pressure, and anomalous observations establish him not only as an exceptional marksman, but also as a figure whose skill transformed the operational landscape. The legend of the White Death, while embellished in folklore, is firmly grounded in a constellation of verifiable facts, each contributing to a narrative of lethal expertise, intertwined with environmental mastery and strategic foresight. Even in the midst of cold reality, the forests of Karelia became fertile ground for stories that transcended the boundaries of mere warfare. Soldiers whispered to each other in the half-light of dawn, tales passed from mouth to mouth, growing in intensity and color with each retelling. The red eyes became more than a description. They became a presence imbued with intent, almost sentient, a watcher in the snow, whose gaze could pierce the thickest blizzard. Villagers spoke of spectral figures moving among the trees, white as the snow itself, appearing suddenly and vanishing without trace. Some claimed to have heard breathing that was not their own footsteps where no one had walked, and glimpses of crimson glinting among the pines at twilight. These stories, while dismissed by some officers as superstition, persisted in the collective consciousness of men who had faced fear, both tangible and ineffable. The tales took on lives of their own in the trenches and encampments. Soldiers began to mark locations on maps where they claimed to have felt the gaze of the red eyes, not seeing a sniper, but sensing a presence that defied explanation. They described it as an almost human intelligence patient, observing, sometimes playful, in the cruelty of its timing. Accounts tell of patrols halting in frozen riverbeds because the feeling of being watched was so overwhelming that progress seemed impossible. Some men reported sudden chills that ran through their bodies, causing them to stumble or freeze mid-step, convinced that something unseen was calculating their every move. These stories were carefully recorded by Finnish officers who understood that the psychological effect on enemy forces could be as powerful as a rifle shot. But even these records sometimes trembled on the line between fact and legend. In villages near the front, local inhabitants contributed their own versions of events. Elderly residents spoke of old spirits that roamed the forests in winter, guardians of the land, who revealed themselves only under the most extreme conditions. The red eyes were interpreted by some as manifestations of these spirits, a combination of human skill and supernatural oversight. Children were warned not to wander too far, their parents telling them that the forest had eyes that could pierce both snow and shadow. These oral traditions, passed quietly among households, added layers of narrative that merged with the stark factual record, creating a tapestry of history woven with threads of folklore. Soldiers began to interpret mundane phenomena as evidence of the supernatural. A branch snapping under the weight of snow might be a signal. A shadow in the corner of the eye became the shape of a figure watching. Footprints left in soft powder only to disappear around a bend of terrain were no longer random. They were signs of the red eyes tracking, testing, and observing. Even seasoned veterans familiar with the harshness of winter and the unpredictability of the forest found themselves questioning reality. They spoke in hushed tones of moments when they could swear they saw a figure poised to fire, then turned to find nothing but snow-laden branches and the silence of the frozen landscape. The Red Army itself began to internalize these tales. Commanders noted that soldiers moved cautiously, hesitating in ways that slowed operations. The psychological dimension became impossible to ignore. Units that once marched with confidence now paused at every shadow, glanced repeatedly at every snowdrift, and spoke in whispers about figures that might not exist, but whose influence was undeniably present. Casualty reports reflected both real losses and the consequences of distraction and fear. Soldiers were wounded or killed in areas where there was no observable enemy, and the unexplained continued to feed the narrative of the Red Eyes, reinforcing the myth, even as real deaths confirmed the stakes. Finnish accounts, while grounded in fact, acknowledged these phenomena with measured tones. Heiha himself made brief notes in his diaries that implied awareness of something beyond the ordinary. He wrote of moments when instinct urged him to pause, when his observations suggested movement that could not be explained by the Red Army's formations. These entries are sparse and understated, yet they reveal a subtle acknowledgement of the extraordinary of an element in the forest that defied conventional understanding. Fellow marksmen and scouts echoed these sentiments, describing the tension of waiting in positions where the presence of the Red Eyes was felt rather than seen, a constant pressure that sharpened focus and heightened fear simultaneously. As the folklore layer developed, stories of encounters began to spread beyond the immediate theater of battle. Soldiers returning home recounted the Red Eyes to family and friends, embellishing details yet remaining consistent in the core description. Eyes as red, unblinking, unyielding, following movements across snow and ice. Some reported sounds, whispers carried by the wind, the subtle crunch of steps without a source, and sudden disturbances in the snow that seemed deliberate. These accounts, when collected, form a pattern of perception, shared among hundreds of individuals, blending the line between human experience and the mythic. Even skeptics conceded that the repeated and consistent nature of reports could not be entirely dismissed. Local legends intertwined with military observations, creating an integrated narrative that shaped both morale and caution. Villagers spoke of the white shadow that protected the land, sometimes interpreted as Heiha himself, other times as a supernatural manifestation. The Red Eyes became a symbol of inevitability and the omnipresence of threat. Children and adults alike internalized the stories, and the effect rippled outward into conversations, songs, and whispered warnings. The forest, already treacherous with its terrain and climate, acquired a sentient quality in the collective imagination. Every patrol, every movement, every night spent in the cold became a stage upon which myth and reality performed a complex interplay. Tales of the Red Eyes were reinforced by unusual events that could not be readily explained. Patrols reported seeing figures pause, shift, and vanish into snowdrifts. Sounds echoed in ways that defied acoustics, and movements in peripheral vision suggested a presence that vanished when directly observed. These accounts were noted in official after-action reports, often with careful language indicating uncertainty. Nevertheless, when combined with multiple independent accounts, a compelling pattern emerged. Soldiers' attention to the phenomenon increased, influencing the timing of movements, the selection of routes, and the allocation of resources for reconnaissance. The folklore did not merely embellish events. It shaped behavior in tangible ways. In addition to direct observation, artifacts of battle were interpreted through the lens of legend. Marks on trees, depressions in snow, and disrupted undergrowth were all imbued with significance. Scouts mapped areas associated with the Red Eyes, marking them as zones of heightened danger. Even in daylight, these markers created caution and hesitation. Every misstep was potentially a confrontation with the unseen, and every successful maneuver reinforced the myth that the forest itself had agency. Reports and oral histories suggest that this awareness altered the dynamic between attacker and defender, giving a small force significant advantage over a numerically superior enemy. The folklore layer extended to the men themselves. Fear, anticipation, and heightened awareness created a feedback loop in which perception and expectation influenced action. Soldiers reported seeing the Red Eyes more frequently during periods of stress or fatigue, and the mere suggestion of the phenomenon could cause hesitation or panic. Accounts consistently describe a duality. The red eyes were both feared and respected. Simultaneously, an enemy and a teacher, illustrating the psychological depth of warfare where belief and reality intermingle. Even the White Death, though disciplined and trained, noted in his diary the subtle influence of fear on human behavior, observing that hesitation in others could be as effective as any rifle shot. By the end of the initial weeks of the Winter War, the red eyes had become an integral part of the narrative of the conflict. Stories circulated among troops and villagers compiled in letters, diaries, and post-war memoirs. They were referenced in discussions among officers who, despite skepticism, could not ignore the consistent reports of unexplained phenomena. Folklore and fact intertwined to create a shared consciousness of the battlefield as a place where natural law was supplemented by perception and legend. The red eyes were both symbolic and practical, shaping movement, morale, and memory. These accounts also contributed to the international perception of the Winter War. Reports of the White Death reached foreign correspondents who recorded not only his lethal skill, but also the almost mythic tales of observers and enemies alike. The stories spread through newspapers and later through historical works, emphasizing the unusual nature of encounters in the forests of Karelia. Red eyes became shorthand for the psychological dimension of combat in extreme environments, a testament to the ways in which individual skill, environmental mastery, and narrative converge in the memory of war. Soldiers returning home, historians analyzing logs, and villagers recounting tales all contributed to a folklore that transcended immediate military significance. The red eyes also influenced tactics indirectly. Patrols were altered to avoid locations of perceived observation units, maintained heightened alertness, and reconnaissance teams adapted their behavior in response to the threat. Even without a tangible sniper in view, the expectation of observation shaped outcomes. Reports indicate that hesitation caused by the red eyes directly affected casualty rates and operational tempo, demonstrating that legend and reality functioned symbiotically. The folklore layer, therefore, was not a distraction, but a factor embedded in the strategic and tactical calculus of the conflict. As winter deepened, the convergence of myth and reality solidified. Soldiers who had initially dismissed the stories began to anticipate the red eyes, incorporating the concept into planning movement and engagement. Observations of environmental anomalies. Shadows, tracks, sounds were interpreted as signs of this presence, heightening vigilance and fear. Diarists noted that even when no threat could be identified, the anticipation of being watched influenced decision-making. The line between human action and supernatural perception blurred, creating a narrative that was both functional in the context of war and resonant in cultural memory. By integrating reports, diaries, and oral traditions, a composite picture emerges of the red eyes as an entity that was at once real and symbolic. They served as a psychological tool, a protective myth, and a representation of human perception under stress. Folklore did not replace fact. It amplified it, providing a framework through which extraordinary events could be understood and transmitted. The forests of Karelia became a stage where skill, fear, environment, and legend converged, producing a phenomenon that would endure in both historical and cultural memory. Soldiers internalized these stories, passing them to the next generation, embedding the red eyes into the narrative of the Winter War. The motifs of the red eyes and the White Death extended beyond isolated incidents, creating patterns that spanned multiple engagements across the Karelia front. The forest snow and winter light combined to shape a theater in which perception, fear, and tactical necessity intertwined. Finnish units noticed that the phenomenon repeated in multiple locations, with soldiers independently reporting similar experiences, fleeting glimpses of crimson, the sense of being observed, unexplained footsteps, and the vanishing of tracks or objects in the snow. These recurring motifs were not limited to individual patrols. They became embedded in operational planning and in the consciousness of entire units. Commanders learned that the anticipation of the red eyes altered behavior, slowing advances, creating hesitation, and inadvertently magnifying the effectiveness of defensive positions. The bridge between anecdote and operational reality was formed in small but significant ways. Skirmishes occurred where units expected minimal resistance, yet soldiers found themselves under observation and fire from positions that should have been impossible to conceal. Even in daylight, shadows in the snow seemed to move independently, and the red eyes became a measure of uncertainty that could not be ignored. Reconnaissance teams recorded patterns of behavior, noting that where the forest provided cover, soldiers reported the most frequent encounters. The combination of terrain knowledge, environmental awareness, and heightened psychological alertness created a feedback loop. The more the soldiers feared the unseen presence, the more cautious and methodical they became, inadvertently aligning with the Finnish defensive strategy. This interplay of terrain and perception produced incidents that blurred the boundary between natural causality and legend. Patrols reported tracks that diverged from visible paths, footprints ending abruptly at snowdrifts that offered no explanation. Frozen branches snapped, and yet the source remained elusive. Sounds echoed unnaturally through the forest, often preceding rifle fire by moments too precise to be coincidence. The red eyes became a narrative anchor for these anomalies, a lens through which both Finns and Soviets interpreted otherwise inexplicable events. Officers began to document patterns, systematically analyzing whether these sightings correlated with casualties, environmental conditions, or specific times of day. Each observation reinforced the motif, embedding the phenomenon deeper into the operational and psychological landscape. Among Finnish soldiers, the motif of the red eyes evolved into an unspoken understanding of the forest itself as a participant in the war. Positioning, movement, and concealment were dictated not solely by tactical calculation, but by anticipation of observation, by something beyond ordinary perception. Heha himself noted that certain snowdrifts, tree lines, and ridges exerted a subtle influence over both enemy and friendly movement, amplifying fear and shaping behavior. In diaries, he recorded instances where hesitation caused by perceived observation altered the outcome of engagements, preventing advancement, or prompting defensive maneuvers that minimized exposure. The motif was functional and psychological, bridging fact and folklore, creating a shared awareness among men that the forest held intelligence and that every movement was scrutinized. In repeated encounters, the red eyes seemed to manifest at critical moments, testing both skill and courage. Units reported observing fleeting red reflections in snow, brief shadows at the periphery of vision, or disturbances in snow that seemed deliberate. Attempts to track or confront these manifestations were unsuccessful, reinforcing the motif of the unseen observer. Soldiers internalized these experiences, and the bridge between individual perception and collective consciousness became a defining characteristic of operations. Fear, anticipation, and myth coalesced, influencing decision-making, coordination, and engagement strategies. This bridge layer demonstrates how motif, legend, and observable phenomenon converged to produce tangible effects on behavior and outcomes in the field. The bridge also extended temporally, connecting early encounters with subsequent skirmishes and broader operational patterns. Historians later noted correlations between initial sightings and later strategic movements. Areas where red eyes had been reported were treated with increased caution, resulting in slower advances and adjustments in troop allocation. Units adjusted patrol patterns, altered formation density, and implemented heightened reconnaissance. The motif functioned as both warning and deterrent, creating a layer of psychological complexity that complemented the physical challenges of snow-cold and uneven terrain. Soldiers' actions, shaped by anticipation of the unseen, directly influenced operational effectiveness and contributed to the broader narrative of the Winter War. The interaction between folklore and fact is evident in this bridge. Civilian reports, veteran diaries, and official military documents intersect, reinforcing the motif across multiple sources. Villagers near the front lines reported strange occurrences, lights in the forest, and movements at night that mirrored soldiers' accounts. These independent narratives corroborated the presence of unusual phenomena, embedding the red eyes within the collective consciousness. Soldiers and civilians alike interpreted these events through the lens of superstition, fear, and experience, creating a network of stories that linked discrete events into a cohesive motif. The bridge demonstrates that operational reality and legend are not mutually exclusive. Rather, they interact to influence perception, behavior, and memory. As engagements continued, The bridge motif manifested in practical adjustments on the battlefield. Commanders began timing movements according to environmental conditions that could conceal observation, utilizing terrain to limit exposure to perceived threats. Soldiers maintained heightened alertness, scanning for visual cues and auditory anomalies that might signal the red eyes. Observation posts were relocated frequently. Patrol routes varied, and units adapted formation strategies to account for the unseen factor. These measures illustrate how a motif that originated in anecdotal observation and folklore became operationalized, influencing the tactics of entire units and the distribution of forces across critical sectors of the front. Bridging multiple encounters. Soldiers' experiences created cumulative effects on morale and cohesion. Units that witnessed or believed in the red eyes reported elevated stress, hypervigilance, and cautious behavior that slowed the pace of operations. However, these same forces gained advantages in awareness and adaptability, responding to environmental cues more effectively than expected. The bridge demonstrates the duality of perception, fear, and myth could induce both hesitation and strategic advantage, highlighting the interplay between human cognition and battlefield dynamics. This duality reinforced the enduring nature of the red eyes as both a symbol and a functional aspect of warfare. The bridge motif also influenced recording and transmission of information. Reports of sightings and encounters were documented with attention to consistency, creating a network of references across units and engagements. Diaries, letters, and official reports cross-referenced locations, environmental conditions, and personnel involved, providing a temporal and spatial mapping of the motif. Even when descriptions varied in detail, the core phenomenon observation by an unseen red-eyed presence remained constant. This constancy reinforced the legitimacy of the motif, blurring the line between anecdote and empirical observation, and ensuring that the red eyes were treated as a credible factor in both tactical analysis and oral tradition. The bridge further connected isolated phenomena to overarching narratives of war and survival. Soldiers' encounters with the red eyes became emblematic of broader struggles against an overwhelming enemy, the harshness of winter, and the omnipresent threat of death. The motif functioned as a narrative device that linked individual experiences to the collective story of the conflict, providing coherence to otherwise chaotic events. Encounters with the red eyes were interpreted as tests of skill endurance and courage, framing the legend within the lived realities of battle and embedding it in the psychological framework of all who experienced the front lines. Through these repeated motifs, the bridge solidified the integration of perception, environment, and legend. Soldiers internalized the presence of the red eyes, adjusted behavior accordingly, and influenced operational outcomes. Officers documented these effects, and the pattern became self-reinforcing. Expectation of observation shaped actions, and actions reinforced the legend. The motif served as both a functional tool and a cultural artifact, illustrating the capacity of narrative, environment, and individual skill to converge in ways that directly influence military effectiveness. By the close of the early winter campaigns, the bridge motif had achieved full integration into both operational planning and cultural memory. Red eyes were referenced in diaries, letters, and post-war histories. They informed tactical adjustments, shaped the experience of soldiers, and became inseparable from the narrative of the White Death. The bridge layer demonstrates the mechanism by which individual legend and collective experience intersected, linking folklore, perception, and fact into a continuum that shaped both immediate outcomes and enduring historical memory. The forest snow and unseen observer had become a combined force, illustrating that in warfare, intangible elements, belief, fear, anticipation, can wield influence as potent as rifles, artillery, or human numbers. Among the deepest snowdrifts and frozen ridges of Karelia, the climax of the Winter War's narrative unfolded in moments both horrifying and surreal. Simoheha, the White Death, had already etched his name into legend, yet even he encountered anomalies that defied explanation. Patrols reported sudden disturbances in snow rifles, discharging unexpectedly, and shadows that moved independently of the wind or the sun. The red eyes, once a motif whispered among soldiers, manifested in ways that challenged comprehension. Soldiers described fleeting figures that disappeared into the frost, as if swallowed by the forest, and yet left traces in the imagination that were as real as the cuts of cold air or the echo of distant gunfire. These phenomena occurred without warning, often at critical moments, altering the course of skirmishes and amplifying the terror of even seasoned troops. The cold intensified the surrealism of each encounter. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, breath crystallizing mid-air, rifles stiff with ice, fingers numb and unresponsive. Soldiers' movements were slowed, their reaction times stretched. In this environment, the red eyes acquired a potency beyond mere visual hallucination. Reports described movements in peripheral vision, the fleeting reflection of crimson in ice-encrusted branches, and unexplained noises that suggested footsteps where no one had walked. These elements created a persistent, invisible pressure. Every step, every glance over the shoulder was measured against an unseen observer, whose intent remained unknowable. The climax layer emerges here, the extraordinary converges with the mortal, producing moments of suspense and dread that surpass conventional battlefield fear. Eyewitness accounts tell of the White Death himself pausing in positions he had occupied countless times. Rifles ready, yet hesitation overtaking instinct. The forest seemed to communicate through the environment. Snow shifts, broken twigs, and subtle distortions of light created an atmosphere where action and inaction were equally dangerous. Soldiers behind Heha observed a man known for impeccable composure faltering ever so slightly. Diaries later indicated that these moments were not fear in the traditional sense, but recognition of something beyond predictable human behavior. The red eyes were not just a threat to life, but a test of perception, patience, and understanding of the forest's rhythm. Critical incidents illustrate the climax most vividly. A Finnish patrol advancing toward a ridge noted the sudden vanishing of a commanding officer. Footprints ceased mid-step, rifle straps still dangling, equipment frozen in position. The soldiers searched the immediate area, finding no evidence of capture, engagement, or natural accident. Reports described their own physiological responses. Heart rates spiking, hands trembling, vision narrowing, as focus centered entirely on the invisible threat. When they returned to the site hours later, impressions in snow had subtly shifted, suggesting movement or presence in the absence of any human or animal agency. Such accounts, repeated across multiple engagements, formed a corpus of inexplicable occurrences that became central to the climax narrative. Red Army correspondence corroborates these disturbances. Commanders noted sudden, unaccountable casualties and disruptions in supply lines. Units reported that soldiers froze mid-march, unable to respond, experiencing a sensation of being observed. Efforts to track the perceived threat often led to confusion, friendly fire, or the abandonment of planned maneuvers. Patterns emerged across sectors of the front. Engagement points that should have been advantageous became sites of anomalous failure. Historians analyzing these records highlight the intersection of tactical skill, environmental extremity, and psychological stress, indicating that the red eyes functioned as both literal and metaphorical forces. In the diaries of Finnish soldiers, particularly those operating alongside Heha, the climax is punctuated by detailed entries of calculated risk and heightened awareness. The sniper noted conditions under which perception of movement exceeded rational expectation, entries describing tracks vanishing mid-step or shadows appearing where no object could cast them. He recorded the precise timing of enemy fire that coincided with these phenomena, suggesting either an extraordinary alignment of circumstance or the presence of an intelligence not attributable to human observation. These accounts, though understated in tone, emphasize the tension and the stakes in these moments. The line between life and death, observation and imagination, clarity and terror blurred entirely. The climax layer also encompasses the human physiological and psychological response. Extreme cold combined with constant vigilance produced fatigue, frostbite, and heightened stress. The soldiers' senses were sharpened beyond ordinary perception, yet that sensitivity also amplified fear. Men reported hearing the crunch of footsteps that did not exist, fleeting reflections in snow that mimicked life, and whispers carried on the wind that defied origin. Each incident reinforced the perception of omnipresent observation, altering the flow of movement, response, and engagement. Even routine tasks became fraught with tension, as the possibility of being watched by the red eyes transformed ordinary patrols into exercises in anticipation, caution, and heightened awareness. Multiple engagements reached points of acute climax when perception and reality converged. Patrols entering dense forested valleys observed simultaneous independent disturbances, footprints that appeared to move autonomously, subtle shifts in snowdrifts and lights, reflecting off equipment in ways inconsistent with known environmental conditions. Soldiers reported reactions ranging from frozen hesitation to involuntary movement toward cover. Each event contributed to a growing consensus that an extraordinary presence beyond the ordinary sniper or soldier influenced outcomes. The Red Eyes were now operationally significant, not only in fear but in strategic impact, disrupting formations, influencing timing, and affecting morale. How his effectiveness in this climax scenario was compounded by his understanding of the human element. He could exploit the fear induced by unseen observation, using minimal physical movement to create maximum psychological disruption. Reports detail moments when he fired on exposed soldiers whose attention was diverted by perceived observation from locations devoid of human presence. The timing, positioning, and impact of these shots reinforced both legend and tactical advantage. Soldiers later recounted that even when no shot occurred, the sensation of being watched was enough to alter behavior, slow movement, and reduce operational effectiveness. This interplay exemplifies the convergence of fact folklore and psychological manipulation inherent in the climax layer. Environmental analysis further illustrates the extraordinary conditions under which the climax unfolded. Snow density, ambient light, wind direction, and terrain features interacted with human perception to produce anomalies that challenged comprehension. Shadows elongated and shortened unpredictably, reflections on icy surfaces created illusions of movement, and auditory cues were amplified or distorted. Soldiers interpreted these phenomena through the lens of legend, reinforcing the Red Eyes motif. The combination of natural extremity and human cognition produced a heightened state of awareness, a liminal experience in which every action, sound, and movement was scrutinized, often with lethal consequence. Finally, the climax is underscored by documentation inconsistencies that enhance the aura of mystery. Reports vary in detail, with some describing visible manifestations of the Red Eyes, others only the sensation of being watched. Casualty records note unexplainable deaths, disappearing patrol members, and the sudden end of footprints in otherwise undisturbed snow. Correlations across multiple sources, Finnish logs, Soviet reports, personal diaries, and post-war interviews illustrate patterns that are improbable but consistent. These records, when synthesized, confirm that the climax of the narrative lies not only in the physical danger faced, but in the convergence of skill, environment, perception, and legend, producing moments of enduring terror and fascination. The culmination of this climax layer leaves observers with a dual realization. The White Death's mastery was formidable, yet even he encountered the extraordinary, and the Red Eyes functioned as both literal threat and mythic presence. Soldiers' fear perception and adaptive behavior combined with environmental anomalies to produce scenarios in which survival depended on more than skill or courage. The forest, snow, and unseen observer operated as integrated elements of a battlefield that transcended ordinary warfare. In these moments, the Winter War revealed the intersection of human skill, environmental mastery, and the unknowable, leaving an indelible mark on both historical record and collective memory. Decades have passed since the forests of Karelia witnessed the tension and terror of November 1939. Yet the legacy of those winter campaigns endures. The land, now quiet and snow-covered for months at a time, still bears traces of a conflict in which skill, environment, and perception intertwined. Simo Heha, the man known to the Red Army as the White Death, returned from the front lines, his life preserved, while many around him did not survive the winter. His exploits became recorded not only in official military documents, but also in diaries, letters, and post-war analyses. The precision of his shots, the efficiency of his camouflage, and his uncanny ability to manipulate the psychological state of his adversaries are preserved as fact, yet intertwined with stories that defy explanation, creating a narrative that spans the boundary between history and legend. Historians studying this period note the consistency of reports regarding the Red Eyes, those phenomena that both soldiers and civilians described across multiple locations. Whether these accounts stem from heightened vigilance, environmental factors, or a collective psychological effect, The repeated consistency renders them a significant aspect of the Winter War record. In villages near the front, tales persisted for generations, glowing eyes glimpsed through the trees, tracks ending abruptly in snow and shadows that seemed to move against the wind. These stories were transmitted orally, often whispered to children and newcomers, as warnings embedding the motif into the cultural memory of the region. The red eyes became more than a feature of battle. They became a symbol, a narrative thread that connected the tangible and intangible, the experienced and the imagined. Physical remnants of the conflict still exist. Trenches and fortifications partially reclaimed by snow and forest testify to the human effort and suffering endured. Local historians and archaeologists have studied the battlefield to understand the interplay between terrain and combat effectiveness. They note the strategic advantages conferred by high ridges, dense tree lines, and frozen rivers. These observations reinforce the accounts of Heha's mastery. His understanding of the forest snow and environmental conditions amplified the efficacy of his operations. Bullets, rifles, and camouflage alone were not sufficient. It was the integration of observation, movement, and anticipation that created his reputation, and that of the Red Eyes as persistent, almost sentient presences. Memoirs and interviews with surviving veterans reveal the enduring impact of perception and fear. Soldiers recounted how the presence of the Red Eyes altered their behavior long after the war ended. Some admitted to hesitation in movement, altered patrol routines, or excessive caution in areas where they had once observed the phenomena. Even decades later, the memory of those encounters shaped their understanding of risk and observation, creating a psychological imprint as potent as any physical wound. In these narratives, the Red Eyes and the White Death coexist as both literal and symbolic forces, a convergence of skill, environment, and story that left an indelible mark on those who experienced it firsthand. Official records, diaries, and letters converged to document not only fatalities and tactical outcomes, but also the extraordinary elements that shaped perception. Casualty reports, for instance, indicate that men were lost in areas where standard engagement would not predict fatalities. Diaries reference fleeting glimpses of red in snow-laden forests, shadows that moved independently, and moments of inexplicable anticipation. These observations are subtle yet consistent, suggesting that beyond conventional skill and weaponry, psychological factors and environmental awareness played crucial roles. Heha's meticulous documentation underscores his awareness of these forces, noting both his own actions and the behavior of those around him, further confirming that perception and legend were inextricably linked. Civilian narratives supplement the military records. Villagers, often eyewitnesses to the ebb and flow of troops, described phenomena that mirrored soldiers' accounts. Unexplained movements, lights reflecting in the snow, and the sensation of being observed by something beyond human. These stories were recorded in letters, journals, and oral histories, and passed from generation to generation. They reinforced the motif of the Red Eyes, embedding it within the cultural fabric of the region. In some accounts, the phenomenon was interpreted as a protective presence, a guardian of the forests, while in others it was a harbinger of danger. This dual interpretation highlights the interplay between fear, respect, and the extraordinary in human perception. The enduring legacy of the White Death extends beyond physical and cultural landscapes into international awareness. Reports of his feats reached foreign correspondents, military analysts, and historians. Accounts emphasized not only his lethal skill, but also the legend of the Red Eyes that followed him consciously or unconsciously, amplifying the psychological effect on enemy forces. Publications, documentaries, and military studies have since examined these elements, confirming that even singular acts of exceptional skill can generate narratives that influence morale, perception, and operational behavior. Heha's integration of observation, environmental mastery, and psychological influence exemplifies how individual agency can impact collective outcomes. Memorials and museums preserve the memory of the Winter War and its participants. Exhibits include photographs of snow-covered ridges, rifles, and field gear, emphasizing the conditions under which soldiers fought. Letters, maps, and personal effects convey the daily realities and the extraordinary circumstances encountered. Visitors encounter narratives of the Red Eyes alongside factual accounts of engagements, creating a layered understanding of how perception, legend, and fact coexist in the human record. These memorials ensure that the memory of the White Death and the phenomena associated with him are not lost to time, allowing future generations to study and reflect upon both the extraordinary skill and the legends that arose in its wake. Modern historians analyze the intersection of environmental, psychological, and tactical factors to understand how the red eyes phenomenon affected the Winter War. They note that extreme cold, high vigilance, and irregular terrain all contributed to heightened perception, leading to experiences interpreted as supernatural or anomalous. Even as contemporary explanations provide rational frameworks, the accounts retain their dramatic and compelling nature. The climax layer of earlier narratives, where inexplicable events produced terror and awe, is now understood within a broader context, revealing how perception, environmental mastery, and legend interact to influence human behavior in conditions of extreme stress. The ultimate impression of the Winter War and the White Death is one of integration. The tangible and intangible, the factual and the folkloric, combine to create a story that persists across time. Soldiers, civilians, and historians collectively shaped the memory of events in a manner that ensured both accuracy and enduring mystery. The red eyes, whether actual phenomena, psychological projections, or symbolic manifestations, became part of the operational reality and the cultural narrative. This enduring duality highlights the complexity of human experience under extreme conditions and the power of perception to shape history as much as action. Even now, visitors to Karelia and historians studying the archives feel the weight of the narrative. Walks through snow-laden forests, examination of documents, and interviews with descendants of veterans reveal an echo of the extraordinary. The White Death's name persists, and the red eyes remain a symbol of vigilance, fear, and the intersection of skill and legend. These layers of memory preserve not only the events themselves, but also the extraordinary psychological, environmental, and narrative forces that made them remarkable. Understanding this legacy provides insight into how stories of war evolve, intertwining fact and folklore to inform perception and memory for generations. You have just heard another shadow story from Shadow Stories. If you want to uncover more hidden truths, subscribe and continue to explore the forgotten and extraordinary. The forests of Karelia still hold their secrets, and the echoes of the White Death and the Red Eyes remain in the snow, waiting for those who are willing to see and remember.